You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 11th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio 2 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Ukraine takes the fight to Moscow amid confusion over whether Donald Trump actually spoke with Vladimir Putin over the weekend. We'll ask what Trump's victory means for Ukraine. After that,
they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
We turn to the Koreas and ask just which version of Donald Trump we're going to get, the fire and fury or the love letters to Kim Jong-un. From there to Baku.
Our SOCAR trading is trading oil and gas all over the world, including in Asia. So to me, these are the possibilities to explore. But in any case, this is something that you need to be talking to SOCAR, and I would be happy to create a contact.
The Azerbaijani hosts of a UN summit on climate change caught on camera pushing for commercial deals, just one of the many questions facing the latest COP29 talks. We'll hear about protests in Serbia as well, calling for the Prime Minister to resign, and we'll get the latest architecture and design news. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. This is The Briefing. Among the first leaders that Donald Trump spoke with last week was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now there are some conflicting reports over whether he also spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the last week, with the Kremlin denying U.S. media reports of a conversation where Trump told Putin to avoid escalation. Either way, the war in Ukraine is clearly going to occupy a fair amount of Trump's first weeks and months in office, starting in January. While the Ukrainian journalist and Chatham House Academy associate Olga Tokaryuk joins us now for more on this. Olga, always great to have you on the show. Before we get to Donald Trump, there's been a pretty unprecedented series of drone strikes on Moscow, a response to Russia's recent attack on Kyiv. What can you tell us?
Hello, Chris. Thank you for having me. Well, Russia in the last week really intensified its attacks on Ukraine. So basically every day, Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities were struck by Russian missiles and drones. And just this morning, there was an attack on President Zelensky's hometown, Kryvyi Rih, where Russian missiles struck a residential building and 8 people were injured, including 2 children. So, when Donald Trump apparently, even if this call happened and if he warned Putin against escalation, the recent developments indicate that fell on deaf ears, and Moscow is continuing to launch missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, and more are expected. Today, Ukrainian government warned that Russia has stockpiled missiles and drones in recent months, and the Ukrainian officials expect more intense attacks on Ukraine in next weeks before Trump takes the office as the new U.S. president.
Now, Olga, perhaps Putin's reaction, whether there was this call or not to, de-escalate, his reaction to that is not particularly surprising, to be frank, at this point. But for Ukraine's response, this was somewhat more unprecedented in terms of these drone strikes on Moscow. Is there a sense in Ukraine that they now have to kind of take the fight to Russia in the next few months?
Yes, well, there were Ukrainian drone strikes in 6 regions of Russia, including some near Moscow, and flights were diverted from 3 of Moscow's major airports over the weekend. It is indeed an attempt by Ukraine to take the fight to the Russian territory, to kind of show that the costs of war for Russia are high, that also Ukraine has its own agency. We know that Ukraine also still holds under its control some territories of Russia. In Kursk region of Russia, there are still Ukrainian troops. Russia is trying to take those territories back now, also with the help of the North Korean soldiers that joined Russian army in fighting against Ukraine on the Russian territory so far. So we can predict that Ukraine will try to keep those territories of Russia under its control as the potential leverage in upcoming negotiations, and also that it will try to use all the tools available to it, and admittedly there are not so many of them, to inflict damage to the Russian military facilities on the Russian territory. So it does so with Ukrainian drones at this moment, because it doesn't have the permission to strike targets on the Russian territory with Western missiles that Ukraine received from the US, UK, and other countries. And potentially that will also be a subject of negotiations between Ukraine and the US, the outgoing Biden administration, and its European allies in the next weeks. There will be urgent push from Kyiv to try to persuade allies to give Ukraine permission to use Western weapons to strike Russian territory before the change in the US administration.
Well, exactly to that point, Olga, about trying to pressure the Biden administration to approve the use of long-range weapons, is there a sense in Ukraine at the moment that, I suppose, time is running out, that Ukraine has to kind of make as much progress as it possibly can in the next few months before Donald Trump enters office and pushes for some kind of perhaps land for peace deal?
Well, absolutely. There is a huge sense of urgency. Biden administration, they declared that they'll be releasing a further $6 billion of the US dollars in military aid to Ukraine. But what Ukraine really needs, of course, it is money, but it is also really the permission to use Western weapons that it already has to strike military targets deep inside Russia. That would give Ukraine significant leverage in negotiations that seem, unfortunately, inevitable at this point. Just, several days have passed since the winner of the US elections was declared, and we've heard multiple declarations coming from the Trump camp about, basically forcing Ukraine to accept the reality, to give up Crimea, to give up the occupied territories, and to make some sort of a deal with Russia. We do not hear similar declarations putting pressure on Moscow, unfortunately. It's mostly the pressure that is being applied to Kyiv, to President Zelensky from the new incoming US administration.
Well, Olga, in that new reality that you are talking about there, I do wonder if there are conversations in Kyiv about what Ukraine can extract. Obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken with Donald Trump as well, and so the question becomes sort of what he is hoping to get from Trump. One question I suppose that I would have is, even if there is a new reality of maybe having to accept giving up territory, would that be, for example, in exchange for NATO membership to ensure that there are no future attacks from Russia?
Well, that would be an ideal scenario for Ukraine, of course, to get accepted into NATO as soon as possible, even those parts of Ukraine that are currently under Kyiv's control. But this is unlikely to happen in the near future. So I think the government in Kyiv is preparing to various eventualities. There is the sense of urgency. There is kind of a sinking feeling of, that Ukraine might be soon left to its own devices. There is still hope that the Biden administration can make some decisions while it is still in power that would enhance Ukraine's negotiating position, and also that Europe will urgently step up in providing to Ukraine more weapons and, at least fulfilling those obligations that were taken by European countries, but were not so far delivered, about, the provision of artillery shells and so on and so forth. So, I think there is kind of an understanding that a new reality is coming, that Ukraine will face significant challenges. But also, if you notice, how the kind of the messaging of President Zelensky to Donald Trump, what he kind of stresses, the point that he makes, he's talking about peace through strength. So he wants to appeal to the ego, if we may say so, of Donald Trump somehow to kind of, that he wants to be seen as a strong leader. He wouldn't want to be seen as someone who just gave up Ukraine to Putin, who contributed to Russia's victory. So I think Ukraine is hoping to play on that maybe a little bit kind of the personal level, the ego of Donald Trump, to talk about America as a great country, strong country, and that Donald Trump should, by continuing supporting Ukraine, enhance also America's position in the world, because doing otherwise would undermine not just Ukraine, but it would also undermine the credibility of the US.
Zelensky will certainly be using his abilities as a master negotiator and communicator as much as he can. Thanks very much, Olga. That was Chatham House's Olga Tokariuk. And now here's Vincent McAviney with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has survived a parliamentary vote and will now lead a fragile minority government. The snap poll went to a runoff for the first time in 30 years, underlining the current weakness of the ruling LDP party. The Kremlin has called reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke with US President-elect Donald Trump pure fiction. Reuters and the Washington Post had independently reported the story, writing that Donald Trump told Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine. Benjamin Netanyahu's spokesperson has confirmed the Israeli Prime Minister approved the pager attacks against Hezbollah in September. The detonations killed 39 people and wounded over 3,000. And the UN Climate Summit COP29 has begun in Azerbaijan. World leaders will look to secure a deal for up to $1 trillion in annual climate finance for developing countries after a year of weather disasters. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Vincent. The last time that Donald Trump was in office, his relationship with North Korea's Kim Jong-un was among the world's biggest flashpoints, going from enemies to love letters in a matter of just a few months. The question for South Korea now, in particular, is just what kind of relationship Trump's second administration will have with North Korea that has since become allied with Russia, sent troops to aid the war in Ukraine, and cut off virtually all ties with South Korea. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Edward Howell, lecturer in politics at Christ Church, Oxford, and author of North Korea and the Global Nuclear Order. Edward, great to have you on the program. First of all, how has Donald Trump's victory gone down in South Korea?
Thank you. I think Trump's victory has clearly caused some element of concern, particularly in relationship to the robustness and the durability of the relationship between the United States and South Korea, which has been bolstered and strengthened considerably in the last 2 years. We've seen much more concerted attempts at information sharing, at strengthening bilateral security cooperation, and importantly, strengthening trilateral cooperation between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. And the questions are now emerging as to whether Trump will continue to uphold these agreements or not. And we must remember that this is all coming at a time when South Korea's interests are very much at stake, particularly given North Korea's growing nuclear threat and, in addition, North Korea's heightened security cooperation with Russia with respect to the Ukraine war.
Well, we'll get to North Korea in a moment, but to that point you're making about South Korea and Japan, it's interesting that Japan's Prime Minister, for example, is once again, similar to 2016, pushing for an early meeting with Donald Trump. Is that kind of thing likely to happen with South Korea as well? I mean, do you see these two countries really trying to get in ahead of others in order to keep this relationship going, as you say?
I think it is in South Korea's interest to continue its so-called pivot or turn to the United States. President Yoon Suk-yeol has made very clear that central to South Korea's vision to be a global pivotal state is not just to be a recipient or contributor to security, but also to be a clear provider of international security. We know that South Korea has strengthened its relationship with NATO, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And I think Seoul will want to make clear that it is able and willing to work with the Trump administration in a productive way and in a way that doesn't compromise on South Korea's both economic but crucially military security.
Is there something there to Donald Trump's, I suppose, transactional style of diplomacy? Does South Korea have something that Donald Trump wants when it comes to some of this that you're talking about, their role in global security? Is that something they might play up, as it were, in order to get concessions from Trump?
Yes, I mean, we know that President Yoon Suk-yeol has already spoken to President-elect Trump via telephone. They've discussed a range of issues, economic issues, and obviously security issues and North Korea. I think President Yoon will want to avoid what happened to his predecessor, President Moon Jae-in, who, during the first Trump administration, basically became a mediator between Washington and Pyongyang, used by both sides as a way of mediating the relationship between the US and North Korea. And I think for President Yoon, this is not acceptable and this would not do, not least because the situation has changed, the geopolitical situation on the Korean Peninsula and in terms of North Korea's broader foreign policy has changed since the first Trump administration.
Well, absolutely. Very, very much so. And to that point as well, I think perhaps, as I mentioned at the outset, it might be easy for some people to forget that before Donald Trump's love letters, so to speak, with Kim Jong-un, there was a moment where that relationship was extremely volatile and required this kind of mediation from South Korea that you're talking about. To move then to North Korea on this, I mean, how unpredictable do we expect this relationship to be this time around?
I think there are two key elements here. The first is that we may even see Trump and Kim resurrect their interpersonal leader-to-leader diplomacy. And I think the North Koreans have already anticipated this because the North Koreans have already made clear, they made clear in July, in fact, that irrespective of the outcome of the US election, irrespective of any revival in interpersonal relations, North Korea's fundamental worldview towards the US, namely as a hostile power, would not change. But I think, secondly, we must also remember that the situation has changed now. And what do I mean by that? Well, North Korea is now not even pretending to engage in any dialogue with the West. It hasn't been doing so for a while. Is it really in North Korea's interest to open up to talk with the US now that it has found a new partner, namely Russia? And I guess to develop upon this point briefly, will North Korea actually be a foreign policy priority for the Trump administration? That's a key question.
That is absolutely the key question, isn't it? And I guess to follow on from that question, is there something that you think North Korea might be willing to do to somewhat get perhaps in Donald Trump's good graces, de-escalate anything, offer some kind of olive branch, or are they really kind of expecting that Donald Trump will, to your point there, I suppose, not have too much interest in this geopolitical situation and kind of leave Kim Jong-un to do whatever he wants?
Well, North Korea has made very clear that it has no intention of putting its nuclear programs and its missile systems on the negotiating table. We've seen heightened provocations, most recently of a solid fuel ICBM prior to the US election. And I think, Kim Jong-un would be willing to meet with Donald Trump if doing so would allow North Korea to continue what it's always been trying to do. Give up a little, if anything, and reap a lot, not least status benefits, prestige benefits, and the whole optical diplomacy that we saw the first time round in 2018 and 2019. But again, the second summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un in February 2019 was a disaster. It ended up with the two leaders not even having lunch, let alone reaching a deal. And after that, North Korea's appetite for negotiations really did decline.
Just very quickly to follow that up, I mean, was there an expectation then in North Korea, basically, that the first time around they got exactly what you're saying? They gave up very little.
I think the North Koreans went into both summits wanting to give up very little and get a lot in return. Whether that be economic concessions such as sanctions relief of a few sanctions, or otherwise. And I think North Korea now knows it's been through one iteration of negotiations with Trump. So actually, what will it actually gain beyond the sort of optics of any diplomacy the second time round?
Dr. Edward Howell, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. The latest UN Climate Change Summit, COP29, begins today in Baku, Azerbaijan, taking place against the backdrop of large protests on the ruined streets of Valencia, where at least 220 people have died and dozens are still missing from devastating floods. Such an extreme weather event would in theory sharpen focus at the UN's climate summit, but the fact that it is being hosted by an oil-exporting state and just a week after Donald Trump's electoral victory, combined with the lack of attendance from European heavy hitters for political reasons, and, well, you can see why there are some questions about what exactly this summit is going to be achieving. Well, Jack Parrott is a correspondent following COP in Baku, and he joins us now. Jack, Azerbaijan's motivations, first of all, for hosting this, how has that been impacting the mood on the ground there, given that they've already been caught in a sort of secret recording trying to spark new deals?
Yeah, it's been a really, really awkward beginning for the COP29 organisers here in Baku. Global Witness, which is an organisation, an NGO, basically did a secret recording with the CEO of the COP, Elmer Sultanov, and basically recorded him in some of the prep calls with a person posing as somebody who wanted to sign fossil fuel deals, and he sort of directed them towards how he would do that. That obviously didn't go down very well. The BBC reported it exclusively. That CEO of the COP29, he went on Azerbaijani TV earlier today saying, listen, this was not really fair. Like, we have a discussion about how we would do these kind of things. They shouldn't have stung me. But it's certainly not been the best look for how they perhaps would have wanted to start this COP conference.
And then beyond that, of course, is Donald Trump's victory last week. I wonder how that's impacting the summit's mood. Is there a sort of a sense of urgency here before he gets into office, or something like the opposite?
Well, this is it. I mean, Donald Trump, during his presidency last time, pulled out of the Paris climate change agreement that was agreed at the COP 9 years ago, which was to try to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. He pulled out of America's promises under that. The rest of the world agreed. And so there are questions about whether he will try and do something similar. Is that even worth it politically for him? This COP, though, really isn't about setting that goal. The world agreed that at that COP nearly a decade ago. What they're trying to do at this one is actually talk about financing. How do we finance a green transition to try and hit those goals? And that is something that, to be fair to the Azerbaijani organisers, they can actually push on. We are very shortly, hopefully within maybe the next 10, 20 minutes, going to have the revealing of the exact precise agenda for the negotiations for the next 2 weeks. And in that, we will see a little bit more about how that financing discussion is going to work.
Well, financing is certainly something they can push on, but still to the point of Donald Trump, what are the hopes of securing that now with the United States? Or is there some expectation that, they could secure a financing deal and others beyond the US would pick up the tab for it?
It's always the big conversation about this. If the US pulls out, it's one of obviously the world's biggest economy, and will that then affect the rest of what everybody else is trying to do? The idea of what global climate action is trying to do is a sort of ecosystem where everybody joins in and does their bit, and that the richer countries help some of the poorer countries to make a green transition. It's this sort of perennial conversation here. I think probably they're hoping that Donald Trump's election won't have too much of an effect on it. But it is important to say as well that current president, still in office president, Joe Biden, is actually not attending this summit. So that's also not a particularly great look for a lot of climate watchers, observers, negotiators, when that administration isn't even coming to Azerbaijan to attend this summit.
It is definitely not a good look to not have Joe Biden there. It's probably not a good look either to not have China there, and Europe for that matter. Ursula von der Leyen is not there. The French and German leaders are also not there. The one person who is there, perhaps Spain's prime minister, will he be making a point about Valencia? Is that something that might be sort of in focus at this?
Yeah, I mean, Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish prime minister, is under a lot of pressure on this specific issue. I mean, the regional governments where those floods took place after the last week are under the real pressure. But obviously, it is a national issue as well. I think he will partly been trying to sort of virtue signal what he's trying to do domestically when he comes here to Azerbaijan. We also have the EU Council president. He's outgoing, Charles Michel. He sort of was walking through the COP climate conference earlier and saying, listen, I'm here, I'm representing the EU. But because his position is pretty much over and frankly hasn't been very strong during his mandate, the hosts and the other world players know that really much of Europe isn't represented so much. The fact that Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, isn't coming, he's having a nightmare domestically with his coalition falling apart. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, isn't coming, as you say. And really, actually, the big one is Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, who is returning to her office, is keeping her job. And when she first took the job 5 years ago, put forward a whole EU Green Deal, has then decided not to attend the COP this time. I mean, she's sort of changing her political priorities for the next mandate towards competition, global competition economically, and moving away from the sort of promises that she made under the green transition, and not coming here as a sort of further symbol of that.
Jack Parrock, thank you very much for joining us from Baku. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now to Serbia, where opposition parties say they're expecting a big turnout for a protest in the capital, Belgrade. It's the latest reaction to the collapse earlier this month of a concrete canopy at the railway station in the country's second city, Novi Sad. 14 people died, and the opposition want Prime Minister Miloš Vučević to resign. Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delany, can tell us more.
Serbia's second city is grieving and angry. Novi Sad saw its biggest protest in decades last week. More than 20,000 people took to its streets and squares, all of them aghast at what had happened the previous Friday. That's when a concrete canopy collapsed at the recently renovated railway station. Tons of concrete, steel and glass crashed down, killing 14 people and leaving the city in shock.
I think this has the potential to grow, simply because it is a focal point for the accumulated anger.
Toby Fogel is a co-founder of the Democratization Policy Council think tank. He warns that the current protests have gone well beyond the usual opposition activists.
Not just the bleeding heart liberals, but many ordinary people who are feeling that they're getting squeezed, their voice isn't being heard, there's no alternative. That could really provide quite an explosive mixture. I feel this is different because 14 people, after all, have died. This is a very tangible failure of the regime. This is not some vague philosophical issue or a directly political issue. This is literally an issue of life and death. And if citizens feel that their regime doesn't value their lives, that might be quite tough to get out of.
Some of the protests have turned violent. The protest organisers blamed agents provocateurs for attacking the city hall and the offices of the governing Progressive Party. But even if some of the participants were plants, the anger was real and widespread. The overriding sentiment from the people on the streets was that the authorities had put their safety at risk. Serbia's president, Aleksandar Vučić, moved quickly to assure the country that action would be taken.
Tražim
I asked the public prosecutor's office in Novi Sad and the government of the Republic of Serbia to ensure that those responsible for what happened are brought to justice and punished severely. As for the government, I call for political responsibility and before that, criminal responsibility too.
The problem for President Vučić is that he's made himself very closely associated with Novi Sad railway station. It's a key stop on the government's flagship infrastructure project, the high-speed line from Belgrade to Budapest. 2 years ago, I travelled with Mr. Vučić on the inaugural service of the first section to open, linking the capital and the second city, and he told me about the project's importance to the country.
This is our way to modern Europe, our way to better and progressive Serbia, and this is something that actually changed the paradigm entirely, and now we have one of the most modern railroads and the most modern trains in southeast part of Europe.
Jó napot kívánok, tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim!
A rally at Novi Sad station alongside Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán marked the end of that journey and supposedly the inauguration of the renovated facilities. But reconstruction continued, and this summer there was another opening ceremony, so the station disaster carried heavy symbolism as well as a high cost in human lives. Construction Minister Goran Vesic resigned, but with great reluctance.
Ne mogu da prihvatim krivicu.
I cannot accept guilt for the deaths, he said, because I and the people who work with me have not an ounce of responsibility for the tragedy that occurred.
Za tragediju koja se dogodila.
That's not going to wash with Serbia's opposition parties. They've been quick to attack President Vučić and his Progressive Party government, claiming corruption and a culture of impunity are behind the canopy collapse.
The slogan of the people is that we are all below this canopy that's called Serbia, so it can collapse to wherever you are.
Biljana Đorđević is the co-leader of the Green Left Front.
There is a feeling that this is a core of the Serbian Progressive Party politics because they base their power on the claim that they are building the country. They are building roads, a railway, the construction, and that this increases the living standard. And that if now people feel unsafe about this, and this was the core of their policy and winning power everywhere, then basically their policy is now seen as invalid.
Analyst Toby Fogel believes that interpretation has some validity. The president and his party have boasted about their prowess in pushing through big infrastructure projects, not just the railway, but new roads and bridges, the Belgrade waterfront project, and an expansion of the country's main airport. For one of those projects to suffer such a catastrophic collapse puts everything else into question.
I think this is potentially extremely damaging for two reasons, really. The first reason is that in an autocratic regime where the big guy decides everything, where nothing works without him, and where his likeness is on the front pages of most of the daily newspapers most days, people will also blame him when something goes wrong. So it's not only the good things that he gets credit for, it's also the bad things that he will have to somehow deal with and that people will blame him for. That's number one. Number two is that obviously Vučić has presented himself really. His big pitch is, I am going to make Serbia more modern, more prosperous. I'm going to bring in all this foreign direct investment. I'm going to bring in these big infrastructure projects, notably the high-speed railway line that, you know, at the eventually is supposed to link Piraeus, Athens, all the way to Budapest. If something goes wrong with one of those big infrastructure projects, and most importantly, if people die, that is potentially explosive for the regime.
Today may bring the biggest protest so far, even as the authorities investigate why the canopy collapsed. Finding quick and credible answers will be the key to calming the crowds. Otherwise, it could be a bumpy ride for President Vučić and his government. For Monocle in Ljubljana, I'm Guy Delaunay.
Thanks very much to our Balkans correspondent, Guy Delaunay. And finally, on today's show, it is time for an architecture and design news roundup. And joining us for that from Oxford is Tim Abrahams, contributing editor to the architectural record. Tim, great to have you back on the show. We're going to start in Warsaw. The Museum of Modern Art is opening there.
Indeed. It's a fascinating building. Warsaw is a city in which modernism was delivered in a time of poverty, post-war, also a time of conquest. So modernism is associated with a kind of imposed aesthetic. So it's quite incredible that the Museum of Modern Art in the city is a very powerful, clear, modernist building, at its most minimalist and its most stylish. So it's in many ways it's a rapid updating. Here's what you could have had whilst everything else was going on type structure. It's delivered on a site that was rebuilt following the destruction of it by the Nazis in 1944. Then there was the Soviet building of the Palace of Culture stuck next to it. So next to that is a new simple building, white, clean, by the New York architect Thomas Pfeiffer, who's also known for the Glenstone Museum in Maryland. And it's far from banal. Unfortunately, it's been given the nickname of Biedronka, or it's been compared to a Biedronka. And Biedronka is a nice word which means ladybird. Unfortunately, Biedronka is also the premier Polish supermarket chain. So the term doesn't quite have the bucolic meaning that it might. There is still much contest over it. It's still open for debate. The building is not yet full. It won't be open until April 2025. But when I went there, I was really impressed with it. It's a very public building. It's clever in the way that the structure straddles the underground system beneath, and I think it has huge potential to embed itself into the cultural scene in Warsaw.
Interesting, Tim. We'll have to look out for that in April. But another story you have for us, the International High Rise Award is being announced tomorrow in Frankfurt.
I love the International High Rise Award. It is always extreme, but it is always because it's the area where you have such a large amount of money is spent creating skyscrapers. You also have an award system which is trying to apply and use and analyze the best of it through looking at it through a social lens or a sustainability lens. We've got 5 buildings. I'll go run through them very quickly. 2 of them are by Bjarke Ingels. One in Singapore, which is like a normal rectangular building right in the middle of the city, which has kind of had a jungle hernia at the mid level. It kind of like this jungle bursting out on the 10th floor. Then we also have another one in Quito in Ecuador, which is tropical brutalists, if I'm being generous. It's quite Lego-y. We have another one in Shenzhen by MVRDV, the Dutch practice, which I think this would be what my money would be on. It's a retrofit of a 1994 building which had problems with poor energy values and was left empty like many in China for a while. And it's been refurbished as a women and children's centre. Bit ticky-tacky looking, some of it, but colourful, bright and social programme. Another building by MVRDV in Amsterdam, which is called the Valley, less successful, I would say. And then we have another Dutch project by a company called Powerhouse, who are both developer and architect. That will be announced tomorrow. I'm looking forward to finding out who the winner is.
We'll see whether your picks were right or wrong on that one, Tim. Just finally, before we let you go, heading to London right here, there's a new boardwalk that's been completed by Asif Khan.
Yes, it's not perhaps the most compelling of projects. It's a boardwalk over a dock, but it's done superbly. And the main thing is its architect is Asif Khan. Now, if you want to be clever, you can say, go down to Canada Water, walk across the boardwalk and say this is the first project in his home city by the next big thing in British architecture. Because Asif Khan is also working on the Museum of London currently, as well as a big project which will be opening next year, the Tselenyi Center of Contemporary Culture in Almaty in Kazakhstan, which I think will really put him on the map. And it's a lovely little project as well. It really does. Often we have these ideas where we have small incidental interventions, architectural interventions, and they look at the industry that was there before and they fixate on it and perhaps overly monumentalize it or gesture towards it. Whereas this Khan has realized that this is the area where the timber from Canada came, and he's created this lovely sensitive timber bridge which comes in waves across the water, symbolizing both the material it was first used, but also the journey that the timber has made to get to London. It's an exceptional little project, actually, and well worth making a trip down to Canada Water for.
I'll be sure to do that when I have a spare moment, absolutely. Thanks very much to Tim Abrahams, contributing editor to the Architectural Record. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvinney. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jamani. Our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.